When were ATMs introduced?
The ubiquitous automatic teller machine, ATM, was introduced in 1967 by Britain's Barclays Bank at a branch near London. 2 years later, the Chemical Bank opened the first ATM in the United States at Rockville Center, New York. Self-service banking grew steadily in the 1980s and took off in the 1990s, when some banks began charging their customers for banking through tellers rather than ATMs.
What was Operation Falcon?
It was the code name for the mid-April 2005 roundup of more than 10,000 fugitives in 1 week. The coordinated nationwide effort was led by the U.S. Marshals Service, together with officers from 960 federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. The Marshals arrested 10,340 people who were wanted for various crimes, many of them violent. The operation took place during Crime Victims' Rights Week. More than 150 of the fugitives were wanted for murder, 550 for sexual assault charges, and more than 600 for armed robberies. There were also escaped prisoners and criminal suspects among those arrested. Operation Falcon was a landmark in law enforcement because of the sheer number of arrests. Previous coordinated efforts had nabbed only hundreds of fugitives.
When was the New York Stock Exchange founded?
The oldest and largest stock exchange in the United States, the New York Stock Exchange, NYSE, had its origins on May 17, 1792, when local brokers who had been buying and selling securities under a designated tree agreed to formalize their business transactions. The NYSE that most people would recognize today opened for business in 1825 at 11 Wall Street, New York City. At the time, most shares traded were in canal, turnpike, mining, and gaslight companies, though a few industrial securities were first traded on the New York Stock Exchange as early as 1831. It was another 40 years before the complexion of trading changed to a more industrial nature. As the nation became increasingly manufacturing-oriented, the companies listed on the exchange reflected the economic shift. Today, if corporations wish to list their stocks on the NYSE, they must have a minimum of 2,000 shareholders. Each of those original shareholders must have 100 or more shares. The corporation must be able to issue at least 1 million shares of stock, and it must also provide a record of earnings for the previous 3-year period. The board of the stock exchange can make exceptions to these guidelines. Corporations may be listed with other stock exchanges, such as the American Stock Exchange, or they may allow stock in their company to be traded as unlisted stocks. which are bought and sold in over-the-counter, OTC, trading. Companies that do not allow shares to be publicly traded are called private corporations.
When was the euro introduced?
The euro, the currency of the 12 European Union nations: Belgium, Germany, Greece, Spain, France, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Austria, Portugal, and Finland went into circulation January 1, 2002, becoming part of daily life for more than 300 million people. The banknotes and coins replaced national currencies, making the franc, Deutschmark, peseta, and lira, among others, history in the participating nations. The euro's origins can be traced to a series of international agreements. Beginning in 1978, which were made among the members of what was then called the European Community, or EC. In February 1986, the framework for the unified monetary system was agreed upon by nations who signed the Single European Act, creating an area without internal frontiers, in which the free movement of goods, persons, services, and capital is ensured. The 1989 Delors report outlined a plan to introduce the currency in 3 phases. The final phase of that plan began on January 1, 1999, when the 11 countries, later to become 12, belonging to the European Union, established the conversion rates between their respective national currencies and the euro, creating a monetary union with a single currency. A 3-year transition phase followed, during which monetary transactions could be made in euro, but there was no requirement to do so. On January 1, 2002, the central banks of the 12 participating countries put into circulation about 7.8 billion euro notes and 40.4 billion euro coins, together worth 144 billion euros. Simultaneously, each country began to withdraw its own currency from circulation. By February 28, 2002, the changeover was complete, meaning the national currencies were completely withdrawn and only the euro was in circulation. When 10 new nations, Cyprus, Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, Poland, Slovakia, and Slovenia, joined the EU on May 1, 2004, there was no timetable for their adoption of the euro. Previously, in 2003, Sweden voted against joining the euro area.
What is international law?
As interpreted by Dutch jurist and humanist Hugo Grotius, 1583 to 1645. Natural law prescribes the rules of conduct among nations, resulting in international laws. His 1625 work, titled Concerning the Law of War and Peace, is considered the definitive text on international law, asserting the sovereignty and legal equality of all states of the world. But the notion also had its detractors. English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, among them. Hobbes insisted that since international law is not enforced by any legal body above the nations themselves, it is not legitimate. Since the 17th century, however, international law has evolved to become more than just theory. During the 1800s and early 1900s, the Geneva Conventions 1864, 1906, 1929, 1949, and the Hague Conferences, 1899, 1907, set forth the rules of war. Today, treaties, between two or among many countries, customary laws, legal writings, and conventions all influence international law, which is also referred to as the law of nations. Further, it is enforced by the International Court of Justice, a United Nations body, as well as by world opinion, international sanctions, and the intervention of the United Nations, apart from the International Court of Justice.
What were the Jim Crow laws?
They were laws or practices that segregated blacks from whites. They prevailed in the American South during the late 1800s and into the first half of the 1900s. Jim Crow was a stereotype of a black man described in a 19th-century song and dance act. The first written appearance of the term is dated 1838. And by the 1880s it had fallen into common usage in the United States. Even though in 1868 Congress passed the 14th Amendment, prohibiting states from violating equal protection of all citizens. Southern states passed many laws segregating blacks from whites in public places. In short, the laws were both manifestation and enforcement of discrimination. Thanks to the civil rights movement, the laws were finally found to be unconstitutional during the 1950s and 1960s.
What was the New Deal?
While the Great Depression began with the stock market crash on Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929, many factors contributed to the financial crisis, including overproduction, limited foreign markets due to war debts that prevented trading, and overexpansion of credit, as well as stock market speculation. Soon the country was in the grips of a severe economic downturn that affected most every American. Some were harder hit than others, many lost their jobs, 16 million people were unemployed at the depth of the crisis. Accounting for about a third of the workforce, families were unable to make their mortgage payments and lost their homes. Hunger was widespread, since there was no money to buy food. The sight of people waiting in bread lines was a common one. It was amidst this crisis, which was soon felt overseas, that Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945, took office as president in 1933. In his inaugural address, He called for faith in America's future, saying, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Roosevelt soon rolled out a program of domestic reforms called the New Deal. For the first time in American history, the federal government took a central role in organizing business and agriculture. Roosevelt initiated aid programs and directed relief in the form of public works programs that would put people back to work. The new government agencies that were set up included the Public Works Administration, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, Security and Exchange Commission, National Labor Relations Board, Tennessee Valley Association, the National Recovery Administration, and the Civilian Conservation Corps. These government organizations soon become known by their initials: PWA, FDIC, SEC, NLRB, TVA, NRA, CCC. Roosevelt's critics charged him with giving the federal government too much power and began calling his New Deal alphabet soup. The president became widely known as FDR. Though the New Deal measures alleviated the situation and did put some Americans back to work, the country did not pull out of the Depression until industry was called upon to step up production in order to provide arms, aircraft, vehicles, and supplies for the war effort. It was during the early days of World War II, 1939–45. The economy buoyed by military spending, that the nation finally recovered. Many New Deal agencies are still part of the federal government today.
What are blue laws?
The term blue laws refers to laws that are intended to enforce moral conduct. They originated in colonial times in Puritan New England, and got the name because they were printed on blue paper. Some blue laws prescribed proper conduct for the Sabbath, which included no working, sports, or drinking. The early blue laws of New Haven, Connecticut, were widely publicized in a 1781 book, A General History of Connecticut. The author, Samuel Peters, 1735–1826, took some freedoms with the text. However, and even invented a few laws of his own. Since blue laws violate individual freedoms, most of them have been repealed through the years. If a community still has blue laws on its books today, they are not likely to be enforced. James Iredell. Jay's was an impressive resume. By the time of his appointment, he had been a member of the Continental Congress, over which he presided as president in 1778 and 1779, served as U.S. Minister to Spain. 1779, during the American Revolution, and joined American statesman Benjamin Franklin. 1706 to 1790, and the rest of the American Peace Commission in Paris, in 1782, to draw up the treaty ending the war with Britain. Once the new republic was established, Jay remained at the fore. He became President Washington's Secretary of Foreign Affairs, 1784–89, and, along with Alexander Hamilton, 1755 to 1804, and James Madison, 1751 to 1836, authored The Federalist, 1787 to 88, which explained the Constitution for the benefit of the states as they considered ratification.
What was the biggest gold rush?
The greatest American gold rush began on January 24, 1848, when James Marshall discovered gold at Sutter's Mill in Coloma, California. Within a year, a large-scale gold rush was on. As the nearest port, the small town of San Francisco grew into a bustling city as fortune seekers arrived from around the world. Due to the influx, by 1850 California had enough people to qualify it for statehood. This pattern repeated itself elsewhere in the American West, including the Pikes Peak Gold Rush in 1859, which effectively launched the city of Denver, Colorado. The gold rush led to the discovery of copper, lead, silver, and other useful minerals. It also spawned related industry. One of the success stories is that of Levi Strauss, 1829 to 1902. A Bavarian immigrant who in 1853 began making and selling sturdy clothing to miners in San Francisco. In other countries, gold rushes had the same effect on the growth and development of regions. After the precious metal was discovered in Australia in 1851, the country's population almost tripled over the course of the next decade. The effect of an 1861 gold rush in nearby New Zealand was to double the country's population in 6 years' time. An 1886 discovery in South Africa led to the development of the city of Johannesburg. Just over a decade later, the infamous Yukon Gold Rush in the Klondike region of Canada spurred development there.
What are the Geneva Conventions?
The Geneva Conventions are humanitarian treaties signed by almost all of the approximately 200 nations in the world today. There were 189 signatories as of 2003. The treaties were forged in Geneva, Switzerland, in 1864, 1906, 1929, and 1949. The initial protocols, of 1864, gave rise to the Red Cross. There were 2 amendments, called protocols, in 1977. In their entirety, the Geneva Conventions set standards for how signatory nations are to treat the enemy during war. They cover access to and treatment of battlefield casualties, treatment of prisoners of war, POWs, and the treatment of civilians. The summaries of each convention and protocol are as follows. Convention I. For the amelioration of the condition of the wounded and sick in armed forces in the field. Sets forth the protections for members of the armed forces who become wounded or sick. Convention II, for the amelioration of the condition of wounded sick, and shipwrecked members of armed forces at sea. Extends protections to wounded, sick, and shipwrecked members of the naval forces. Convention 3, relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, Geneva. Lists the rights of prisoners of war. Convention 4, relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war, Geneva. Deals with the protection of the civilian population in times of war. All four conventions were ratified as a whole in 1949. Protocol I. Additional to the Geneva Conventions of August 12, 1949, and relating to the protection of victims of international armed conflicts. Extends protections to victims of wars against racist regimes and wars of self-determination. Protocol II, additional to the Geneva Conventions of August 12, 1949. And relating to the protection of victims of non-international armed conflicts. Extends protections to victims of internal conflicts in which an armed opposition controls enough territory to enable them to carry out sustained military operations. The Geneva Conventions, along with the Hague Conventions, 1899, 1907, comprise much of what is called international humanitarian law, IHL. Because so many nations of the world have ratified both the Geneva Conventions and the Hague Conventions, they are considered customary international law, which means they are binding on all nations.
Supreme Court decided.
Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution, 1788, states that the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court. It goes on to describe the High Court's jurisdiction, but it does not specify how the court was to be formed or how many justices it would consist of. These matters were left to Congress, which in 1788, the year the Constitution was ratified, passed the first Judiciary Act, formulating the court's original organization. It had just 6 members, the Chief Justice, plus 5 associates. Subsequent congressional acts have modified the Supreme Court's organization and jurisdiction. Since 1869 the court has consisted of 9 members. The Chief Justice and 8 associates who, once named, serve for life. Justices are appointed by the President but must be approved by the Senate. According to Article 2 of the Constitution, to avoid partisanship, Congress is prevented from lowering the salaries of any of the justices, and justices can only be removed from the bench by impeachment. A formal document that charges a public official with misconduct. Cases reach the High Court through appeal, lower court decisions that are formally challenged, and the justices make their rulings based on a majority vote. Who was the first Chief Justice of the U.S.?
What were indentured servants?
During colonial times in America, there were two kinds of indentured servants, voluntary and involuntary. Voluntary servants were people, often trained in a craft or skill, who could not afford passage to the colonies. In exchange for their passage, they agreed to work for a period of 4 to 7 years for a colonial master. At the end of this period, the servant became a freeman and was usually granted land, tools, or money by the former master. Involuntary indentured servants were criminals whose sentence was a period of servitude. The impoverished, or those in debt. Most indentured servants were involuntary. Their period of obligation to a colonial master was longer than that of a voluntary servant, usually 7 to 14 years. But, like their counterparts, the involuntary servants also received land, tools, or money at the end of their contract, and they, too, became freemen. The arrival of indentured servants in the American colonies addressed a labor shortage that emerged in the early 1600s. In 1618 the Virginia Company, a joint stock enterprise that encouraged the development of Virginia, adopted a new charter based on the head right system. Englishmen who could pay their own Atlantic crossing were granted 50 acres of land. Each of their sons and servants were also granted an additional 50 acres. Other colonies were also developed under the head right system, with the land amounts varying by colony. Soon there were more farms than there was labor to work the fields. The colonists solved this problem through the system of indentured servitude. Many indentured servants were drawn from England, Ireland, Scotland, and Germany. In European ports, people contracted themselves or became involuntarily contracted to ship captains, who transported them to the colonies, where their contracts were sold to the highest bidder. Roughly half the colonial immigrants were indentured servants. Colonial laws ensured servants would fulfill the term of their obligation. Any servant who ran away was severely punished. Laws also protected the servants, whose masters were obligated to provide them with housing, food, medical care, and even religious training. The system was prevalent in the mid-Atlantic colonies, but it was also used in the South. When the economies of the Caribbean islands failed at the end of the 1600s, plantation owners sold their slaves to the mainland, where they worked primarily on southern plantations, replacing indentured servants by about 1,700. In other colonies, the system ended with the American Revolution, 1775 to 83.
Who was John Peter Zenger?
John Peter Zenger, 1697 to 1746, was a New York City printer who was accused of seditious libel in 1735. His case changed the definition of libel in American courtrooms and laid the foundation for freedom of the press. The German-born Zenger immigrated to the American colonies in 1710, when he was 13 years old. He found a job as a printer's apprentice, working on the colony's official newspaper, the New York Gazette. 15 years later he began his own operation, which was mostly concerned with printing religious pamphlets. In 1733 New York received a new colonial governor from England. William Cosby quickly earned the contempt of the colonists, both rich and poor. Prosperous businessmen who opposed Cosby and his grievous tactics approached Zenger, offering to back a newspaper that he would both edit and publish. Zenger agreed, and on November 5, 1733, the first issue of the weekly journal was released. It included scathing criticisms of the royal governor, raising Cosby's ire. After burning several issues of the papers, Cosby had Zenger arrested in November 1734. The editor-publisher continued to operate the journal from inside his jail cell, dictating editorials to his wife through the door. Zenger's case went to trial in August 1735. Prominent Philadelphia attorney Andrew Hamilton, 1676 to 1741, considered the best lawyer in the colonies, came to Zenger's defense. Hamilton admitted his client was guilty of publishing the papers, but, he argued, that in order for libel to be proved, Zenger's statements had to be both false and malicious. The prosecution contested the definition of libel, asserting that libelous statements are any words that are scandalous, seditious, and tend to disquiet the people. The court agreed with the prosecution, and Hamilton was therefore unable to bring forth any evidence to support the truth of the material Zenger printed in the weekly journal. The defense argument was not heard until the closing statement was made by Hamilton. His summation stands as one of the most famous in legal history. He accused the court of suppressing evidence, urging the jury to consider the court's actions as the strongest evidence, and went on to declare that liberty is the people's only bulwark against lawless power. Men who injure and oppress the people under their administration provoke them to cry out and complain. The brilliant attorney closed by urging the gentlemen of the jury to take up the cause of liberty, telling them that by so doing, they will have baffled the attempt of tyranny. The 7 jury members were convinced by Hamilton's impassioned speech and found Zenger not guilty. Discharged from prison the next day, Zenger returned to his printing business, publishing the transcripts of his own trial. While colonial officials were reluctant to accept the case's ruling on the definition of libel, the case became famous throughout the American colonies. And once the colonists had thrown off England's royal rule and established a new republic, the nation's founding fathers codified the Zenger trial's ruling in the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution guarantees freedom of press.
What is habeas corpus?
The writ of habeas corpus, which is roughly translated from the Latin as "you should have the body," is considered a cornerstone of due process of law. It means that a person cannot be detained unless he or she is brought in person before the court, so the court can determine whether or not the person is being lawfully held. The notion dates back to medieval England. Many historians believe that habeas corpus was implied by the Magna Carta. 1215, Article 39 states, "No freeman shall be taken or imprisoned, or exiled, or in any way destroyed, except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land." The writ was reinforced by Britain's Habeas Corpus Amendment Act of 1679, which stated that the Crown, King or Queen, cannot detain a prisoner against the wishes of Parliament and the courts. The English introduced the concept in the American colonies. And when the U.S. Constitution 1788 was written, it declared, in Article I, Section 9, that habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. For example, during the Civil War, 1861–65, President Abraham Lincoln 1809–1865, suspended habeas corpus, and during Reconstruction, 1865–77. It was again suspended in an effort to combat the activities of the Ku Klux Klan.
What was Black Tuesday?
It was the day the stock market crashed Tuesday, October 29, 1929, signaling the beginning of the worldwide economic downturn called the Great Depression, 1929–39. On Thursday, October 24, 1929, stock values declined rapidly following a 5-year period in which the average price of common stocks on the New York Stock Exchange had more than doubled. The prosperity of the 1920s and the widespread sale and purchase of Liberty bonds, U.S. government bonds, to help finance World War I, 1914–18, had encouraged many Americans to invest in the stock market. With the market robust, timing seemed right for speculation, and America's experience with Liberty bonds had made many people comfortable with and interested in investments. So when the stock market dropped precipitously on that fateful October day in 1929, the effects were felt by many. On the following Monday, prices again plummeted. On Tuesday, October 29, stockholders panicked, selling off more than 16.4 million shares, and prices nosedived. Institutions were also affected, banks, also investors, lost huge sums of money, forcing many to close their doors. News of the stock market failure and bank closures caused many Americans to try to withdraw their money from their deposit accounts, leading to the famous run on the banks. The late October financial crises marked the beginning of a decade of hard times.
How did the American tobacco industry get started?
Tobacco, a member of the nightshade family, is an indigenous American plant. When Christopher Columbus, 1451–1506, arrived in the West Indies in 1492, he found the native inhabitants smoking rolls of tobacco leaves, called tino. The word tobacco is derived from the Spanish tabaco, which is probably from tino. The practice of drinking smoke was observed to have a relaxing effect. Upon returning to Spain, Columbus took seeds of the plant with him. By 1531 tobacco was being cultivated on a commercial scale in the Spanish colonies of the West Indies. In 1565 English naval commander John Hawkins, 1532–1595, introduced tobacco to England, where smoking was condemned as a vile and stinking custom by King James I, 1566–1625, decades later. Tobacco was not commercially cultivated on the North American mainland until English colonist John Rolfe, 1585–1622, carried seeds from the West Indies to Jamestown, Virginia, where he settled in 1610. By 1612 he had successfully cultivated tobacco and discovered a method of curing the plant, making it a viable export item. Jamestown, Virginia, became a boomtown, and England's King James, who collected export duties, changed his mind about the habit of smoking. The coastal regions of Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina were soon dominated by tobacco plantations, and the crop became the backbone of the economies in these colonies. Cultivation of tobacco did not require the same extent of land or slave labor as did other locally grown crops such as rice and indigo, but it depleted the nutrients of soil more rapidly, causing growers to expand their lands westward into the Piedmont region, the plain lying just east of the Blue Ridge and Appalachian Mountains. In 1660 British Parliament passed the Second Navigation Act, declaring that tobacco and other articles from England's American colonies could only be exported to the British Isles. Tobacco prices dropped in response to the legislation, and the colonial economies were weakened, causing political discontent with the mother country. But European demand was not diminished, and the colonists soon resumed exports, despite the Second Navigation Act. By 1765 colonial exports of tobacco were nearly double in value the exports of bread and flour. The crop helped define the plantation economy of the South, which prevailed until the outbreak of the American Civil War, 1861–65. During the 1800s companies such as R.J. Reynolds Tobacco and American Tobacco were founded. Despite the highly publicized dangers of using tobacco, smoking or chewing, tobacco has remained an important crop, and the manufacture of tobacco products an important industry in the American South.
What is the system of scientific management?
A system to gain maximum efficiency from workers and machinery, scientific management. Also known as Taylorism, was developed by American industrial engineer Frederick Winslow Taylor, 1856–1915. As foreman in a steel plant, Taylor undertook time and motion studies and conducted experiments to determine the one best way to do any given job, developing detailed systems to yield the highest possible productivity levels. He first presented his theories in 1903 to the American Academy of Mechanical Engineers. Efficiency was the cornerstone of Taylorism. Production processes should not waste time or materials. He published his ideas in the landmark work The Principles of Management, 1911. And became a well-known engineering consultant, contracted by companies eager to maximize their output. The doctrine of scientific management was embraced by American industry. As transportation networks improved and the U.S. population grew rapidly in the early 1900s, markets expanded, placing great demands on industry. Applying Taylor's scientific management, manufacturers were able to boost productivity by as much as 200%. Since Taylorism broke production processes into individual tasks, each with its own best practice, new workers could be quickly and easily trained, which adherents believed was another benefit of the concept. Scientific management had many advocates, including engineers Frank, 1868 to 1924, and Lillian, 1878 to 1972, Gilbreth, who furthered Taylor's work, publishing volumes such as Primer of Scientific Management, 1911, Psychology of Management, 1912, and Studies on Motion, Fatigue, and Time. Among those who applied scientific management were Ford Motor Company, in developing the assembly line for the Model T. Boston retailer Fillings, one of the first commercial enterprises to use the method. And Bethlehem Steel, which conducted experiments in the loading of pig iron. Scientific management also had its detractors. Taylorism was criticized for having a dehumanizing effect on labor. In making every job routine, some charged that the system separated the minds of workers from their hands, eliminated the need for skilled workers, and gave management absolute control over production processes. Nevertheless, principles of scientific management remain evident in the workplace today. And the adoption of scientific management is credited with boosting American productivity and increasing stockholder profits. Theories concerning worker output were modified during the second half of the 20th century.
What were the navigation acts?
Between 1645 and 1761, British Parliament passed a series of 29 laws intended to tightly control colonial trade, shipping, and industry to the benefit of English interests in America. These acts, which were largely ignored by the American colonists, were intended to ensure that the British colonies in North America remained subservient to the mother country. The initial Act of 1645 forbade the import of whale oil into England, unless it was transported aboard English ships with English crews. Subsequent laws, those passed in 1651, 1660, and 1663, provided the basis of the Navigation Acts. The first Navigation Act, 1651, resembled the legislation of 1645, but was more far-reaching. It stipulated that goods could only enter England, Ireland, or the colonies aboard English, or English colonial, ships. Further, colonial coastal trade was to be conducted entirely aboard English ships. The Second Navigation Act, 1660, reaffirmed that goods could only be transported aboard English ships and established a list of enumerated articles that had to be shipped directly to England. The intent was to prevent the colonies from trading directly with any other European country. England required the colonies to sell their materials to English merchants or pay duties on goods sold to other countries. The list of articles included sugar, cotton, tobacco, indigo, rice, molasses, apples, and wool. In 1663 Parliament passed the Staple Act, making it illegal for colonies to buy products directly from foreign countries. European countries would first need to ship their products to England or pay customs fees. Through the Navigation Acts, England tried to establish itself as the gatekeeper of colonial imports and exports. But the laws were difficult to enforce, and the colonists easily circumvented them. Smuggling was rampant. Still, the laws, which continued to be passed until the eve of the American Revolution, 1775–83, had little effect on the colonial economy, which grew at twice the rate of England's during the period.
Why was the completion of the Erie Canal important to you? S. Development.
Completed in 1825, the Erie Canal joined the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes, linking the east with the west and for the first time allowing freight and settlers to easily move back and forth between the regions. Begun on July 4, 1817, the canal was sponsored by Governor DeWitt Clinton. 1769–1828, of New York, who planned and eventually carried out the huge building project. The waterway was funded by the state of New York, which paid just over $7 million to complete it. The original canal was 363 miles long, 40 feet wide at the surface, and 4 feet deep. It had 83 locks, which raised vessels 562 feet between the Hudson River and Lake Erie. A lock is a section of a canal that can be closed to control the water level, and is then used to either raise or lower a vessel to another body of water. Beginning at Albany, New York, on the Hudson River, which flows into the Atlantic Ocean at New York City. The canal extends west as far as Buffalo, New York, on Lake Erie, one of the 5 Great Lakes. The waterway, which was inaugurated by the run of the barge Seneca Chief on October 26, 1825, could transport passengers aboard boats and move cargo aboard barges, which were pulled by teams of horses and mules on the ground. In spite of the critics, who dubbed the ambitious project Clinton's Wonder and Clinton's Ditch, the canal's positive impact on the American economy was felt within the first decade of its operation. The new transportation route reduced freight rates both eastward and westward. Made Buffalo a major port in the region and New York City a major international port, was a catalyst for population growth. In upstate New York and throughout the Old Northwest, the present-day states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota, and prompted other states, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, to build canals, further opening up the country's interior to development and commerce. Since crops could be shipped from these lush farmlands and as more farms came into existence, the Erie Canal helped supply the newly arrived immigrants in the eastern cities with food. In turn, they shipped manufactured goods west to the farming communities. The canal was enlarged several times between 1835 and 1862 to increase its capacity. In 1903, New York voted to link the canal with 3 shorter waterways in the state to form the New York State Barge Canal, which opened in 1918.
What are the Hague Conventions?
They are international treaties, 1899, 1907, covering the laws and customs of war. The First Hague Convention developed out of the Peace Conference of 1899, held in The Hague, the Netherlands, and convened by Russian Tsar Nicholas II, 1868 to 1918. Among the original goals was limiting the expansion of armed forces. Though the representatives there, from 26 nations, including the United States, failed to agree on a resolution to limit such expansion, they did agree on certain rules of engagement for war on land and at sea. Also, very importantly, they adopted the Convention for the Pacific Settlement of International Disputes. This convention set up the Permanent International Court of Arbitration and Justice, still in existence today. The court is in The Hague, where it is housed in the Peace Palace. A gift of American industrialist and philanthropist Andrew Carnegie, 1835 to 1919. A later convention, the Second Hague Peace Conference, was held in 1907. Representatives of 44 nations met for a period of 4 months. The Convention of 1907 modified and added to the first. Delegates resolved to meet again in 1915. But that conference was not held due to the outbreak of the First World War. The Hague Conventions were the forerunners of the League of Nations and the United Nations. How was the makeup of the U.S.?
Who invented the assembly line?
Ford Motor Company founder Henry Ford, 1863 to 1947, is credited with the creation of the assembly line, an industrial innovation that allowed cars to be produced quickly and efficiently. In 1913, 10 years after founding Ford Motor Company, Henry Ford installed the first moving assembly line in one of his Model T manufacturing plants. The innovation proved to be the beginning of the consumer age. The assembly line allowed greater efficiencies in auto production, which, in turn, reduced the price of a quality car, putting it in reach of the ordinary person. Soon, manufactured goods of every variety would be mass-produced.
Why was Ford's Model T important?
The enormous success of the Model T, a Ford Motor Company car introduced in 1908 and manufactured until 1927, has been the source of extensive analysis and commentary by historians, sociologists, economists, business writers, and pop culture experts. The Model T has been credited with not only changing America but with defining it. When Ford Motor Company founder and President Henry Ford, 1863 to 1947, unveiled the prize Model T in October 1908, he hailed it as a motor car for the great multitude. The product lived up to the promise. The internal combustion vehicle had been in production in the United States only since the 1890s. But in the decade preceding the Model T's debut, manufacturers and consumers alike had come to regard the horseless carriage as a luxury item, custom-made for wealthy Americans. Ford had conceived of a different and, as the company would advertise throughout the century, a better idea, a car that was simple to operate, easy to service, comfortable, and affordable. The Model T had a wooden body on a steel frame, 4-cylinder, 20-horsepower engine. Tank capacity of 10 gallons, in the touring sedan, or 16 gallons. In the runabout, and a completely enclosed power plant and transmission. It was also lighter than other models. Through large-scale production, based on a system of interchangeable parts, the Model T took 728 minutes, just more than 12 hours, to build and sold for $850, lower than the price of other automobiles, but still beyond the reach of the average American. Nevertheless, 17,000 Model Ts were bought by American consumers the year they were introduced. Ford improved production methods to realize greater economies and lower the price each year. Sales steadily rose. The company raised eyebrows in the business community when it offered workers an 8-hour day for $5 a day, twice what other factory workers were earning. Ford explained that this was merely good business practice. By raising the wages of his factory workers, Ford enlarged the potential market for his Model T. In 1914, Ford implemented the moving assembly line. It used the principles of scientific management, where each job has one best way of being accomplished, to bring unprecedented efficiency to manufacturing. Assembly time per car dropped to just 90 minutes. That year the Ford plant in Highland Park, Michigan, produced almost 250,000 Model Ts. To keep up with ever-rising demand, operations were sped up and capacity increased to the point that one day in 1925, Ford produced one Model T every 10 seconds. That year the car retailed for just $295, making the so-called Tin Lizzie. Or the Flivver, accessible to working-class families. By 1927, when Ford retired the Model T so the company could respond to consumer demand for cars with better performance, power, and styling, the company had turned out 15 million Tin Lizzies. Ford's innovative Model T, a reliable, no-nonsense, mass-produced automobile. Manufactured on a moving assembly line, brought mobility within the reach of the average American. It had changed consumer mindset to view the car as a necessity.
Who was Rosie the Riveter?
The term referred to the American women who worked factory jobs as part of the war effort on the home front, where auto plants and other industrial facilities were converted into defense plants to manufacture airplanes, ships, and weapons. As World War II, 1939–45, wore on, more and more men went overseas to fight, resulting in a shortage of civilian male workers. And so, women pitched in. However, at the end of the war, many of these women were displaced as the men returned home to their jobs and civilian life. Nevertheless, the contribution of all the Rosie the Riveters was instrumental to the war effort.
Who was Rosie the Riveter?
The term referred to the American women who worked factory jobs as part of the war effort on the home front, where auto plants and other industrial facilities were converted into defense plants to manufacture airplanes, ships, and weapons. As World War II, 1939–45, wore on, more and more men went overseas to fight, resulting in a shortage of civilian male workers. And so, women pitched in. However, at the end of the war, many of these women were displaced as the men returned home to their jobs and civilian life. Nevertheless, the contribution of all the Rosie the Riveters was instrumental to the war effort.
Why did the auto industry boom in the post-war era?
In the years following World War II, 1939–45, auto ownership in the United States soared. From 27.5 million registered vehicles in 1940 to 61.5 million in 1960. Americans had resumed their love affair with the automobile, inextricably linking the car with the U.S. history of the post-war era. Many factors combined to bring about the automobile's widespread popularity. During World War II, the car manufacturers curtailed auto production, converting factories to military production and turning out some $29 billion in materials, including trucks, jeeps, tanks, aircraft, engines, artillery, and ammunition. With the conflict ended, automakers stepped up production to fulfill the unmet demand of the war years, and soon found themselves working to meet new demand, created by an increase in consumer spending and the growth of the suburbs. The overall prosperity of the late 1940s and 1950s produced a new spirit of consumerism. Government regulations, brought about through the efforts of the labor unions, resulted in increased wages and improved benefits, meaning Americans, for the most part, had more disposable income. Advertisers took advantage of the new medium of television to reach wide and eager audiences. The housing industry, largely dormant during World War II, built new neighborhoods around the edges of American cities, making the automobile a necessity rather than a luxury. The Big Three, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, increased capacity to meet the tremendous demand, setting new records for production in 1949 and 1950. By 1960, more than 3 out of every 4 American families owned at least one car. The infrastructure raced to keep pace with a nation on wheels. Superhighways were built, covering some 10,000 miles of road. Motels and fast food restaurants went up along roadsides, and shopping centers were built outside city centers. While imports would challenge the American automakers in the decades to come, it was the U.S. manufacturers that defined the post-war era.
Why did the auto industry boom in the post-war era?
In the years following World War II, 1939 to 45, auto ownership in the United States soared. From 27.5 million registered vehicles in 1940 to 61.5 million in 1960. Americans had resumed their love affair with the automobile, inextricably linking the car with the U.S. history of the post-war era. Many factors combined to bring about the automobile's widespread popularity. During World War II, the car manufacturers curtailed auto production, converting factories to military production and turning out some $29 billion in materials, including trucks, jeeps, tanks, aircraft, engines, artillery, and ammunition. With the conflict ended, automakers stepped up production to fulfill the unmet demand of the war years, and soon found themselves working to meet new demand, created by an increase in consumer spending and the growth of the suburbs. The overall prosperity of the late 1940s and 1950s produced a new spirit of consumerism. Government regulations, brought about through the efforts of the labor unions, resulted in increased wages and improved benefits, meaning Americans, for the most part, had more disposable income. Advertisers took advantage of the new medium of television to reach wide and eager audiences. The housing industry, largely dormant during World War II, built new neighborhoods around the edges of American cities, making the automobile a necessity rather than a luxury. The Big Three, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, increased capacity to meet the tremendous demand, setting new records for production in 1949 and 1950. By 1960, more then 3 out of every 4 American families owned at least one car. The infrastructure raced to keep pace with a nation on wheels. Superhighways were built, covering some 10,000 miles of road. Motels and fast food restaurants went up along roadsides, and shopping centers were built outside city centers. While imports would challenge the American automakers in the decades to come, it was the U.S. manufacturers that defined the post-war era.
Why was the introduction of plastic important to industry?
Pioneered in the early 1900s, plastic, which is any synthetic organic material that can be molded under heat and pressure to retain a shape, affected every industry and every consumer. As a malleable material, plastic could quite literally be molded for countless uses, both for the production of goods and as a material in finished goods. In 1909, Bakelite plastic was introduced, and over the next 3 decades the plastics industry grew, developing acrylic, nylon, polystyrene, and vinyl, polyvinyl chloride or PVC, in the 1930s, and polyesters in the 1940s. The applications seemed endless, from household items such as hosiery, clocks, radios, toys, flooring, food containers, bags, electric plugs, and garden hoses, to commercial uses such as automobile bodies and parts, airplane windows, boat hulls, packaging, and building materials. The space industry and medicine have also found critical uses for plastic products. Scientists have continued to find new applications for plastics in products such as compact discs, CDs, computer diskettes, outdoor furniture, and personal computers, PCs. The material has become essential to modern life.
Why was the introduction of plastic important to industry?
Pioneered in the early 1900s, plastic, which is any synthetic organic material that can be molded under heat and pressure to retain a shape, affected every industry and every consumer. As a malleable material, plastic could quite literally be molded for countless uses, both for the production of goods and as a material in finished goods. In 1909, Bakelite plastic was introduced, and over the next 3 decades the plastics industry grew, developing acrylic, nylon, polystyrene, and vinyl, polyvinyl chloride or PVC, in the 1930s, and polyesters in the 1940s. The applications seemed endless, from household items such as hosiery, clocks, radios, toys, flooring, food containers, bags, electric plugs, and garden hoses, to commercial uses such as automobile bodies and parts, airplane windows, boat hulls, packaging, and building materials. The space industry and medicine have also found critical uses for plastic products. Scientists have continued to find new applications for plastics in products such as compact discs, CDs, computer diskettes, outdoor furniture, and personal computers, PCs. The material has become essential to modern life.
When did IBM enter the personal computer business?
IBM, International Business Machines, organized in 1924, had long been an industry leader in developing and producing computers for business and science, but in August 1981, the company jumped into the consumer business, competing with upstart Apple for a share in the personal computer, PC, business. The PC introduced by IBM used a Microsoft Disk Operating System, MS-DOS, and soon captured 75% of the market. Observing the company's enormous success, other firms began producing IBM clones, which could use the same software as the IBM PC.
When did IBM enter the personal computer business?
IBM, International Business Machines, organized in 1924, had long been an industry leader in developing and producing computers for business and science, but in August 1981, the company jumped into the consumer business, competing with upstart Apple for a share in the personal computer, PC, business. The PC introduced by IBM used a Microsoft Disk Operating System, MS-DOS, and soon captured 75% of the market. Observing the company's enormous success, other firms began producing IBM clones, which could use the same software as the IBM PC.
When was Microsoft founded?
It wasn't all that long ago, 1975, that computer whiz Bill Gates, 1955. Founded what is now the dominant manufacturer of computer software. So dominant that the company has faced antitrust allegations from the federal government. Gates was only 19 years old when he founded the business with his friend Paul Gardner Allen, and he had dropped out of Harvard to do so. It paid off. Gates was a billionaire by age 30. Though he's undoubtedly a math ace. He scored a perfect 800 in math on his SATs and began writing computer programs when he was all of 13. Gates has more than once credited the success of Microsoft to not his own programming skills but to hiring the best programming talent for the Redmond, Washington-based company.
When was Microsoft founded?
It wasn't all that long ago, 1975, that computer whiz Bill Gates, 1955. Founded what is now the dominant manufacturer of computer software. So dominant that the company has faced antitrust allegations from the federal government. Gates was only 19 years old when he founded the business with his friend Paul Gardner Allen. And he had dropped out of Harvard to do so. It paid off. Gates was a billionaire by age 30. Though he's undoubtedly a math ace. He scored a perfect 800 in math on his SATs and began writing computer programs when he was all of 13. Gates has more than once credited the success of Microsoft to not his own programming skills but to hiring the best programming talent for the Redmond, Washington-based company.
What was the Embargo Act?
On December 22, 1807, President Thomas Jefferson, 1743–1826, signed the Embargo Act, prohibiting ships that were destined for foreign ports from leaving the United States. The legislation had been drawn up in an effort to pressure France and Britain, which were then at war and had been seizing U.S. merchant ships to prevent each other from receiving American goods. The situation began after the French Navy was crushed by the British under Admiral Horatio Nelson. 1758–1805, at the Battle of Trafalgar, October 1805. French ruler Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769–1821, turned to economic warfare in his long struggle with the British, directing all countries under French control not to trade with Britain. Its economy dependent on trade, Britain struck back by imposing a naval blockade on France, which soon interfered with U.S. shipping. Ever since the struggle between the two European powers had begun in 1793, the United States had tried to remain neutral. But the interruption of shipping to and from the continent and the search and seizure of ships posed significant problems to the American export business. The Embargo Act was an attempt to solve these problems without getting involved in the conflict. But the effort failed. The embargo made sales of U.S. farm surpluses impossible. New England shippers protested the act and were joined by Southern cotton and tobacco planters in their opposition. Nevertheless, the embargo remained in effect for 14 months, during which the American economy suffered and many ships resorted to smuggling. In 1809 Congress passed the Non-Intercourse Act, which limited the shipping embargo to France and Britain. All other foreign ports were again open to U.S. ships. 3 years later, the United States was drawn into the conflict, fighting the British in the War of 1812–14.
What was the Embargo Act?
On December 22, 1807, President Thomas Jefferson, 1743–1826, signed the Embargo Act, prohibiting ships that were destined for foreign ports from leaving the United States. The legislation had been drawn up in an effort to pressure France and Britain, which were then at war and had been seizing U.S. merchant ships to prevent each other from receiving American goods. The situation began after the French Navy was crushed by the British under Admiral Horatio Nelson. 1758 to 1805, at the Battle of Trafalgar, October 1805. French ruler Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769 to 1821, turned to economic warfare in his long struggle with the British, directing all countries under French control not to trade with Britain. Its economy dependent on trade, Britain struck back by imposing a naval blockade on France, which soon interfered with U.S. shipping. Ever since the struggle between the two European powers had begun in 1793, the United States had tried to remain neutral. But the interruption of shipping to and from the continent and the search and seizure of ships posed significant problems to the American export business. The Embargo Act was an attempt to solve these problems without getting involved in the conflict. But the effort failed. The embargo made sales of U.S. farm surpluses impossible. New England shippers protested the act and were joined by Southern cotton and tobacco planters in their opposition. Nevertheless, the embargo remained in effect for 14 months, during which the American economy suffered and many ships resorted to smuggling. In 1809 Congress passed the Non-Intercourse Act, which limited the shipping embargo to France and Britain. All other foreign ports were again open to U.S. ships. 3 years later, the United States was drawn into the conflict, fighting the British in the War of 1812, 1812 to 14.